Hi, ladies and gentlemen. This is Ed Butowsky with ChapwoodFinance.com. I'm honored to have John Williams, the founder of ShadowStats.com, as my guest today. John, thank you for joining me.
Ed, thank you so much for having me with you.
Many of you know that I do not believe in any way, shape, or form that the CPI, the government's number, the Consumer Price Index, accurately reflects the rising cost of living for most Americans. In fact, I created my own index called the Chapwood Index to address this. Where did I come up with this idea? Well, there was a man named Albert Singlinger many years ago. I used to read his information, and then unfortunately he passed away. And then I found my way to John Williams, who we have today. And John, I love your work. I think Shadow Stats is one of the best and most important websites that's out there today. And what I'd like you to do is really directly focus on one thing. Why is the CPI, how does the government manipulate that number? Because we know it's not a government or a partisan issue. It's not a Democrat or Republican. But how do they manipulate it? Why do they manipulate it? What's not in it? And please share that with us today.
Sure. Over the last 3 decades, the federal government has changed the way it calculates the CPI to accomplish 2 things. One, the CPI no longer reflects what you pay out of pocket. Most people assume that the CPI reflects what they're paying out of pocket for things.
Right.
And it does not measure in the inflation, the cost of living, of maintaining a constant standard of living. Why you would want an inflation measure that doesn't measure what it costs to maintain a constant standard of living, I don't know. Going back centuries, that was the whole purpose of these consumer price indices. The one that's been put out by the government since 1913 actually goes back to 1888, reflected that up until the 1990s, and in the 1980s they started changing things around so that it didn't reflect things out of pocket.
And now this doesn't only affect, because one of the reasons they manipulated this is to slow the cost of living increase. So government wages and salaries and Social Security increases were lower. But this also impacts everyone watching right now who's not a government worker, who's not off of Social Security. It affects what their wages are, because most employers will raise a wage based on the CPI, but if the CPI is not represented properly, people are then falling behind. Is that not true?
That's true, and people don't know that they're not getting a good number. The CPI is deliberately understated, and I'll get very specific on that in a minute, so that if you're receiving a payment that's based on the CPI, you're being underpaid.
And how does the government do that?
How does the government do that?
How do they make the number, and what do they do without getting too detailed, but detailed enough so people appreciate that what we're telling them is the truth?
Well, to start with, they're trying to do the same thing right now that they did back in the 1990s with the CPI to reduce the cost of living adjustments for Social Security. It's part of the budget negotiations. One thing that both Republicans and President Obama reportedly have agreed upon. They're going to put in a new CPI. Alan Greenspan back in the 1990s said that CPI overstates inflation. We need a lower, more accurate rate of inflation that'll help with the budget deficits and balance it on the back of those who are receiving Social Security payments. And he effectively said that. So if you ask him why it was overstated, he said very simply that if, let's say, steak gets very expensive, people will buy more hamburger instead of steak. If they buy more hamburger, they're not spending as much, the cost of living is less, inflation is not as high. And while that might be true, that's not the way inflation is defined for the CPI on a traditional basis. That's not the pricing things to maintain a constant standard of living. If you've got an inflation measure which measures a constant standard of living, you're able to buy the steak. You don't have to cut back on steak.
That's right.
It goes up in price. So what the government did was they changed the reporting. They very haphazard, wherever they could put in a gimmick to adjust the CPI, they make it a substitution-based as opposed to a fixed weight index. The fixed weight gives you the constant standard of living. The substitution-based gives you an inflation measure that measures the cost of a declining standard of living. Why anyone would want that, I don't know, outside of the government, because it enables them to reduce the cost of living payments that they pay on Social Security. The other thing they did was back in the 80s, they started introducing what they call hedonic quality adjustments to the prices. Now, these are things that they can't measure, at least not normally. They've developed econometric programs, computer programs that will make all sorts of measurements and estimate what the effect is on price, because quality is going up and the price is going up. They adjust the upside price movement downward because of the better quality. Simple example goes back to an early use of this, where the government had mandated gasoline additives that would give you much higher quality air as a result. The effect was to add 10 cents per gallon to the cost of gasoline, which at the time was a significant amount. Well, that didn't show up in the CPI. The reason it didn't show up in the CPI was because the government deemed it to be a quality improvement, and therefore it was not inflationary. But the poor guy that was filling his tank of gas, moaning and groaning because it was costing him 10 cents more per gallon to go to work, he wasn't thinking, oh boy, no.
But he wasn't, exactly. Now, with the numbers you do, shadowstats.com, I've been a subscriber for many years, and I encourage anyone watching this to go to shadowstats.com and sign up. It's not very expensive. You probably need to raise your how much you charge, but and anybody should go to that. I encourage them to do that. But at the same time, when you go to that site, how is it that you're calculating the cost of inflation or the rising cost of living versus what the old government numbers were?
The government very simply is they changes. They estimate the effect on the reporting of the CPI. I've taken those estimates, I've added them back in. And since 1980, the aggregate changes that they have made to the CPI, they've all generally been to the downside on the CPI, to total in excess of 7 percentage points. So that where you're getting officially 2% inflation right now, year on the CPI, it would be closer to 9% if it was reported the same way it was back in 1980.
Okay, so that's an incredibly important point. When the government right now is saying that your cost of living is going up 2%, and as a result of that, your wages go up about 2%, Social Security payments go up about 2%, and everything that's tied to that number goes up 2%, but it's really going up about 9%. That means if your employer only paid you 2% more, they basically have said, I'm going to make your life 7% tougher this year than the year before. And if you do that over a 5 or 10 year period, that's why there's so many people in my mind, John, that are living off of what the government has for them, because they have fallen behind, and everyone has a threshold of pain, and when they reach it, they'll do anything they can, and right now they go to the government. Do you agree with that?
That's a fair statement. Consumers cannot make ends meet, and if they can't keep up with inflation, you can't have growth in the economy. The consumer drives consumption, and without the growth in income, you don't have the growth in the GDP.
Yeah, this is a real disaster, because people just blindly accept this number. There's about 60 to 80,000 items that are calculated every month in the CPI. Is that correct?
I don't know the exact count. That certainly is in the, at least in the general ballpark.
Because every single month that this number is announced, I just kind of laugh, instinctively, and then I look at your newsletter and I get the real number. So, John, continue doing the work you're doing. Anyone watching this, learn more about this. Please do it as soon as you can, because the more we start understanding how the rising cost of living is affecting you, the better you're going to be, because then you'll be able to help solve for that problem, which is a whole nother discussion. But I encourage everyone to go to www.shadowstats.com, read more about this. And John, I look forward over the next couple of months having you back on and talking more about these numbers. And you also do it for employment, you do it for retail sales, you do it for a number of other statistics. Is that correct?
That's correct, Ed. And I thank you for your kind invitation. I will look forward to seeing you.
Great. Thank you very much, sir.
Very well.